Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los doyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
Que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta, Ibero, dime tú, pa' que tú inventas. Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí pa' cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
What's good, everybody? Happy Saturday. This is Ramiro from Anticonquista. Isn't that music just beautiful? That is something that just inspired me. Right now, I was dancing in my seat. My hips were moving. I was like, Con Cuba no te metas. That is a new video released by the Ministry of Culture from Cuba in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. We have some serious stuff to talk about today, but we just wanted to kick it off with that joyful and inspirational music from our sisters and brothers in Cuba in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. And today we're going to be talking about the recent imperialist attack, the designation of Cuba as a quote unquote state sponsor of terrorism, which we know is complete bullshit, but it represents something very dangerous and something serious for our people in Cuba. We have to show our support from the US. A lot of things are going on. And so I just want to introduce some of the comrades who are here today. We have Comrade Nick Ayala, who is a co-editor of Anticonquista based in Newark. We have Comrade Anya Chatouyer with Hood Communist All-African People's Revolutionary Party, Venceremos Brigade. You name it, she does it. She's everywhere on the ground. We have Comrade Victor Coronado, co-host of Sons of Fidel with Danny Shaw. We have some more comrades who are probably going to be joining us later on throughout the stream, but we wanted to give a space for those of us who have been active in the Cuba Solidarity movement to really speak out against this horrible imperialist maneuver and aggression. There are some really serious and dangerous times ahead of us, and we have to stick together. We have to speak out against the US government. Shout out to everybody in the chat. Shout out to Volti. Shout out to Erica. I love Erica. Shout out to Colorful Outcast, to Lewis Williamson, to Hood Communist, to Guillermo Matias in Brazil, to everyone who follows and likes Anticonquista, to Sons of Fidel, to Red Condor, to everybody who's connected to our community. And so I just wanted to give some space to, maybe we can start off with Comrade Anya Sanwo. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement in the Cuba Solidarity movement?
Thanks. Very, very happy to be here. Very, very happy always to show up for Cuba. So as you mentioned, I'm a cadre with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is a revolutionary Pan-African Socialist Party. That's my political home. I also serve on the National Coordinating Committee of the Visítanos Brigade, and the Visítanos Brigade is one of the oldest solidarity delegations from the US to Cuba in existence. I actually went to Cuba for the very first time last summer with the Visítanos Brigade at the 50th anniversary delegation. But I had love for Cuba for a very, very long time before that, simply because I'm an African revolutionary, and Cuba has showed up for Africa like no other nation has. Like, Cuba is one of the realest friends Africa has ever had. People are probably familiar with the example of Assad Shakur being persecuted by the US government for the crime of trying to liberate her people, and Cuba, of course, taking her in. But what folks are less familiar with is that that happened dozens of times with many different African revolutionaries. And beyond that, Cuba has sent material support, military support, doctors, resources to Africa and to the entire African diaspora to assist in times of crisis, to assist with anti-colonial struggles. If not for Cuba, COVID-19 would look a lot worse in a lot of African nations and a lot of Caribbean and Central and South American nations. And so my personal connection to Cuba is that Cuba has shown up for the African Revolution, and so I feel a commitment to show up for Cuba.
That's what's up, Anya Sanwo, Comrade Anya Sanwo out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm out here in LA, in Cali. So Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And I know you've actually been to Cuba. I'm jealous because I haven't been there yet, and I've been trying to get there a few times and it hasn't worked out. But Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do with Anticonquista and also your experience in Cuba?
Yeah, so I'm a co-editor of Anticonquista, as Ramiro said earlier, and you know, I really I respect and look up to and admire the Cuban Revolution because being Puerto Rican, Cuba and Puerto Rico is often described as two wings of the same bird. They're very deeply connected, and there's always been a deep connection and solidarity between the Cuban and Puerto Rican people, as well as with the Dominican people as well. And this is, you know, Cuba as revolutionaries and as a revolutionary history in Latin America is, I think, one of the most important revolutions and one of the most important anti-imperialist nations in Latin America that we need to look up to, defend, and you know, not necessarily repeat, but at least try to take the strategies that they use in their revolution from the 1960s to today, because the revolution is ongoing. Any Cuban will tell you that the revolution never stops. And we need to adopt those policies to our own nations and to our own, you know, struggles, whether it be in Latin America, in Africa, or even in Asia. You know, one of the things that I admire most about Cuba is its dedication to international solidarity and internationalism, which is something that even some more powerful socialist nations may have failed to do. But Cuba, you know, looking at Cuba, it's a small island nation, and it's considered one of the more poor socialist nations, and yet it has such a strong dedication to internationalism and international solidarity that it's amazing. And not just to other socialist nations, but to every nation. Even people here in the U.S., it's extended a hand of solidarity out to. So I think that's one of the things that makes Cuba so amazing in my eye.
Yeah, most definitely. And shout out to Revolución Internacional. They said, como dijo Carlos Puebla, Cuba no está sola. Exactly right. Cuba's not alone. They think they can attack Cuba and people won't care, but all the world is looking after Cuba. Most definitely. And even us from the United Snakes of America, where we're streaming live to you from. Victor, what's good? How's everything in Jersey? I'm glad you're with us.
What up? What up? What up? How's it going, comrades?
Good, good. So, Victor, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, the work you do with Sons of Fidel, and why you support the Cuban Revolution?
Sure. Victor Coronado. I'm based out of New Jersey, and co-host of Sons of Fidel with Professor Shaw, professor out of CUNY. And I've been, I'm a little retired from the world of activism, although I'm trying to figure out how to get back involved. We do obviously the Sons of Fidel stuff, the anti-conquista stuff, but that's kind of something that I've been going back and forth with at my age of trying to figure out how to juggle that with work life and family life and whatnot. But in my 20s, all I did was just organize. I don't like to talk too much about myself, but I did a lot of organizing in my 20s. All over the state of New Jersey, a little bit in the Dominican Republic, and now we're doing this program dubbed Sons of Fidel with Professor Danny Shaw. What was the other question you asked me?
Why do you support the Cuban Revolution?
Well, yeah. So I learned about the Cuban Revolution. I remember being a teenager and just being the imperialist propaganda. That Cuba's terrible, and Fidel Castro is this evil dictator, and that's that whole narrative, right? And then I got put on to some revolutionary music, which led me to some revolutionary books, which led me to going to certain protests and organizing with certain folks. And then I'll never forget, someone said to me, have you read anything from the perspective of the Cubans, right? The actual Cuban revolutionaries who took power, how they defend their, and I said, no, I haven't done that. So I started doing that. And then I just started talking to folks on both sides. And then you kind of get a better perspective of what Cuba's about. And I mean, we've laid it out in Sons of Fidel plenty. I mean, obviously the name itself, Sons of Fidel, we're paying homage to that giant, that David who went up against Goliath. And Cuba, Cuba is a sovereign nation that carved out its own path, and the United States empire has just not been able to forgive them or forget what they've done, right? To be able to just do something vastly different than everyone else and say, fuck that, we're doing this our way, the way we want to, and we will defend this to the end, right? And even if it costs our own lives. So I mean, it's just all the things that progress. I've said this on the last Sons of Fidel podcast. So all the things that progressives are fighting for now, right? Cuba's already gotten accomplished, right? And there's this economic question in Cuba of how to make the economy better so it could work for folks. But that, again, folks want to always point to that, the detractors, without ever mentioning the blockade, which is illegal. It's an imposition, and how do you not put that into like, my parents are from the Dominican Republic. I can't imagine a blockade against the Dominican Republic for 50 plus years, like what that would do to the economy. So, the reason why I support the Cuban Revolution is it's very simple. I mean, they've been on the right side of history, over and over and over. And the things that they've gotten accomplished are the things that progressives are really trying aspire to accomplish here in the United States. They've already done it in Cuba. And there's this economic question. And, we need to, now, we're within this context of what's happening now with the Trump administration labeling them a terrorist, a terrorist. What's the term?
State sponsor of terror.
Ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we're going to get into a little bit of into that, but I mean, I think it's absolutely utterly ridiculous that we would label them that, and considering our own history. I mean, we have no moral. There's no moral. We're in no moral right to label them a state sponsor terror, given our own history. So
most definitely. Yo, and shout out to, in the chat, Alex Marquez, Solidarity from South Carolina. Shout out to Martian Astronaut. Said U.S. imperialism is living on borrowed time. It's death's door, and it's attacking everything out of sheer desperation. Most definitely. Shout out to, again, Alex, to PLK. So just to give y'all some background on what actually happened, I think this was on January 11th that the Trump administration officially redesignated Cuba as a, quote, state sponsor of terrorism, which it had done in the past under Obama. That was changed, and now they're doing that back. Keep in mind, this is the last few days of Trump's administration. Trump is about to be on his way out with all the shit that's going on here in the US, in DC especially. And it's interesting because there are other things that are going on simultaneously on the international front. You also have the illegal state of Israel occupying, settlers expanding their occupations in, I believe is in West Bank. And also you have more funds for war, more funds for terrorism, US terrorism abroad. And in terms of the designation of Cuba as a, quote, state sponsor of terrorism, it has a really big effect. It's not just words, it's not just an empty threat. This has a direct impact on Cuba's everyday activities, day-to-day activities. Imagine if right now you're struggling to get by, you're living paycheck to paycheck. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. I'm sure a lot of us here are too, and who are watching and listening. And out of nowhere, Chase hits you up and they're like, or your bank hits you up, and they're like, hey, we can't like have your accounts anymore because you're a terrorist. So you have to find a new bank. And now you have to move your money elsewhere. You can't have certain accounts. Certain companies are not able to do business with you. That's happening on a national level with Cuba. This has huge implications for Cuba. This means that there's a ban on exports, sales, medicine. You're talking about people who are now, it's going to be even harder to get medicine, diabetes, any other COVID-19 stuff that's going on. This is going to make life very hard for the Cuban people. Luckily, the Cuban government has survived this for decades and has understood that in order to survive, you have to adapt, change, trade with other countries, Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela. And they'll get through this as they always have, and as they did during the special period in the 1990s. But I think it's important for us as Latin American, Caribbean people in the diaspora, as Africans, as indigenous people, to come together to show our solidarity with Cuba, because in the belly of the beast in the United States, we have to show our solidarity. We have to fight the empire from within. And so going into a little bit about your connections with Cuba, because all of us here, like, it's interesting. We all, like me, I think Victor, you haven't been to Cuba before, right?
I haven't, no.
Okay. So Comrades Nick and Anya Sanwo have been to Cuba. And so I wanted them to talk a little bit about what that experience was like, what they learned from it, and how it applies to what's going on today with Cuba. And so maybe Comrade Anya Sanwo, if you want to start.
Sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah, just maybe tell us about your experience going to Cuba, what it was like, a rundown of what you did out there, and how it strengthened your commitment and resolve to defending the Cuban Revolution.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so like I mentioned last summer, I was on the 50th anniversary delegation of the Venceremos Brigade to Cuba so I was there for 2 weeks. We traveled all across the island. It was a very, very militant schedule. We started like 5 a.m. with like roosters and then went to like 7 a.m. And we would be basically hearing seminars from different segments of Cuban society talking about how they're organized. So we heard from students groups, we heard from workers unions, we heard from Senesex, which is the organization that works around gender and sexual equality and around LGBTQ rights. We heard from Africans living in Cuba, because one of the things when I was going there, I remember Europeans were like, isn't it racist? And I was like, compared to what? And also, no, it's not. We heard from all different sectors of Cuban society, basically trying to give us like a broad overview of what Cuba is actually like. And so, like I said, I had never been there before, but I knew about what happened with Asada. I knew about Cuban assistance with anti-colonial struggles in Africa, so I was already a fan. But I had also lived in the United States for almost my entire life, and I'd heard nothing but lies about Cuba, just that it was a dictatorship, that people weren't allowed to speak freely, that it was like heavily policed and all kinds of things. And then I went there and I saw it, and none of that was true. I saw one cop the whole time, and he was in the airport. I saw one security camera the whole time, again in the airport. I felt more free in my body as like an African woman, as a queer African woman, than I've ever felt anywhere. So it was just very like, I was like, wow, like they're just like bald-faced lying about what Cuba is like. None of this is true. They are much more free, much more democratic, have much more of a sense of ownership of their government than US citizens can even conceive of. And like the way that they broke down how it was organized, how through like the communities for defense of the revolution, through the unions, through the workers' organizations, through the party, how every sector of Cuban society is organized to fulfill the will of the Cuban people. And so it became clear to me that Cuba could not possibly be a dictatorship because the people themselves would not allow that. And not only would they not allow that, but they themselves are organized to prevent that from happening. Like if they had wanted Fidel Castro to be overthrown, Fidel Castro would have been overthrown. They were organized to do that. It was very, very, very clear. So it was just very, it was eye-opening to realize that I had been taught just blatant lies about this place, like just complete fabrications. And it really sharpened my anti-imperialist analysis. It made me a much more militant anti-imperialist. And right after I got back from Cuba was the coup that overthrew Evo Morales in Bolivia, where people were like, oh, it's not technically a coup, always patriarchal. And I watched that and I was like, wow, they literally just like bald-faced lie. Like they do this constantly. They're doing it to Cuba, they did it to Bolivia, they did it to Venezuela, they've done it to Ghana, they've done it to Libya. So it was very, very eye-opening to see how different the reality of Cuba was versus what is told to people in the United States.
Most definitely. And Nick also, who is again one of the co-editors of Anticonquista, he also has had the opportunity and the chance to go to Cuba. Nick, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience there?
Yeah, so my experience was similar, very similar in that it was we had it was with the Witness for Peace delegation, and we were speaking to different individuals, different organizations, different collectives in Cuba who were organized, expressed their, what their feelings were on the government, what their feelings were about pre-socialist government and post-socialist government. It was interesting. We talked to one group. It was an art collective of I think it was called La Mujeres Negras. And it was basically older Black women who created dolls for the community. And a lot of these women were old enough where they lived before the Cuban Revolution, and they talked about the differences between pre-Cuban Revolution and post-Cuban Revolution. And so that was very powerful because they talked about how before the Cuban Revolution, they really had very limited rights. They were being mistreated. There was extreme racism, extreme xenophobia, extreme anti-Blackness, and but then after the revolution, a lot of those cultural things changed gradually, not instantaneously, but it took some time, but gradually they started to see that that they were gaining rights, they were gaining freedom, and their lives really had changed. On the screen is something that I think is important to talk about because in Cuba there's a museum that we went to as well. I forget the specific name of the museum, but I kind of know it as the CIA Museum in Cuba. It's a museum which documents the CIA atrocities in Cuba. And I think this is important to talk about when we talk about the U.S. labeling Cuba as a state sponsor of terror, because in Havana, there's an entire museum dedicated to the terrorist actions that the United States has perpetrated against Cuba. These actions range from biological warfare, destroying their crops, main crops like sugar crops, which would destroy the Cuban economy. Things like radio communications, which were meant to essentially kidnap Cuban children and bring them to the United States in order to have them grow up and be propagandized to be anti-Cuba. All of these types of things. One of the things that really struck us the most, I think, that struck me personally the most was when Fidel first came to power. There was the literary campaign that was launched, which was to eliminate illiteracy within the nation. Now, this was one of the most successful literary campaigns, I think, in the world. It took about 1 year, and they were able to completely eradicate illiteracy, which mostly resided in the rural areas of Cuba amongst the campesinos. And a lot of it was being done by young teenagers, anywhere from 16 to like 20 years old, who were going out from the cities to the rural areas in order to teach people who were illiterate and make them literate. And one of the most barbaric things that we learned about this was while this was going on, the United States was launching paramilitaries to attack these literary teachers, and, as well as the students, the campesinos who were learning from them. Conrado Benitez was one of those. He was 18 years old. He went from the city to the rural areas to be a teacher. And paramilitaries from the United States, funded by the United States, went and murdered him and tortured him just for trying to eradicate illiteracy within his own nation. Now, that's the type of terrorist actions and activities that the United States has perpetrated against Cuba. But at the same time now, and even 5 years ago when the U.S. had Cuba designated as a state sponsor of terror, we are the ones who are perpetuating terrorism against Cuba, despite the fact that we're labeling them as state sponsors of terror. And it's pretty amazing the hypocrisy and the contradictions that exist just within that relationship. That was one of the things that struck me the most when I went there, just how gruesome and how brutal the U.S. state was towards the Cuban people, who weren't even, these weren't even people who were necessarily trying to be involved politically or be involved in the government necessarily. They were just trying to do what they felt was right for their people, for their nation. And the U.S. was willing to go all out, just trying to murder them. It's kind of like how there's propaganda around the Cuban doctors who go and help out other countries. They try to say that they're being what is it that they're being like they're enslaved or something, or they're being like trafficked. It's like human trafficking, bringing these doctors to other countries. It's absolutely ridiculous, the lies that we're being told here in the States.
Yeah, that shit doesn't even make sense, because if they were in another country, wouldn't they just dip out like once they leave?
Yeah.
Like that should just. But yo, before we go to Victor, because I want to hear from you, Victor, as well, about like a little deep dive into how like what you find really inspiring about the Cuban Revolution. I just want to shout out Comrade Yamir, who's one of the also comrades involved with Anticonquista, with Red Condor, with Diaspora Tribune, with Sons of Fidel, the whole Anticonquista familia, straight out of Queens. Shout out to Queens. I'm from New York, born and raised in New York. How's it going out there, Yamir?
It's going good, comrades. Feels good to be part of this right now. Sorry to come in late, but you already know it's I gotta do it for Queens out here, But
we're gonna write you up, man, for being late. Nah, I'm just fucking around. Cool. So before we go to you, Yamir, because I know Comrade Yamir has also been to Cuba, and we want to hear about his experience seeing Cuba and seeing the reality of it. Victor, why don't you tell us a little bit about like how your journey into learning about Cuba and the revolution, and how it has inspired you in your personal life?
Sure. So I kind of alluded to it earlier. I think I started. Someone asked me the question of again, have I ever read have I ever read any literature that was put out by basically by the state, right? Or like Fidel Castro himself, or Che Guevara himself, etc. And I said no, and I started doing that, and that's what really, that's when I really started to get a better understanding of, because it's one thing to read about the Cuban Revolution from any perspective, right? Whether people who are defending the Cuban Revolution from that perspective, people who are in contra, against the Cuban Revolution. But it's another thing really I would challenge anyone to please read Fidel Castro, like read his speeches, like read, the stuff that he's put out, because it's fascinating. It's just there's so much information there. There's so much really, really good information there. It's going to really broaden your scope. And so, yeah, that's how I got into it, and then you start talking to comrades and you start talking to people, both from both sides, right? Like people who are against it. And it's interesting. Like I'm in Jersey. So, we got Cubans, not only in Miami, but Jersey's another hub. Right. And the Cubans, these type of Cubans, they just, let's say they look more like, I'm gonna put it out there. They look more like me. They look more European. I look more European than I do. I've gotten all my life. Oh, you don't look Dominican. Well, people are saying that, whether they're consciously or subconsciously, whether they consciously or subconsciously are saying this. What they're saying is that you're not Black, you're not Afro-Dominican, you're not Afro-Latino, and some people don't even really know that that's what they're saying, but that's really what they're saying. And it's just curious, because you start talking to a lot of these Cubans out here, and they're white, and they have certain prejudice, they have certain certain type of philosophy, certain type of ideology, and they defend Cuba pre the revolution, right? They defend that nonsense. They defend that. They were like, everything was great before Fidel Castro took power. No, it wasn't. We know this, right? We know that that there was the American mafiosos and the congressmen used to go out there, and they called it, Cuba was known as the whorehouse of the Caribbean, right? You went out there to gamble and to order high-end prostitutes and do whatever it is that you were doing out there, right? So there, the Cuba was, before the revolution, was just an absolute mess. I mean, I don't know how you could defend Cuba before 1959, before, and I'll stop there. But before we move on, back to this idea that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. I just, for folks who are listening, and again, I always like to try to, for the folks maybe who are curious, who like, it's one thing to know, okay, this is where I stand. But folks who are curious and they're on the fence or are trying to learn, Google Luis Posada Carriles and Google Orlando Bosch. All right. These were two known terrorists that the United States was harboring, right? These were two known terrorists, right? And all you need to do is, and just for some context, and this is right from the book, My Life with Fidel Castro, Ignacio Ramonet did a whole interview with him, and it was, I think in Spanish it's 100 horas con Fidel, something like that. It was something like that, but I recommend folks check that out, My Life with Fidel Castro. And in the notes on page 643, and again, this is stuff that folks can fact check. But on October 6, 1976, and this is getting back to Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles. On October 6, 1976, a Cuban civilian plane is blown up in midair off the coast of Barbados. 73 passengers died. Venezuelan and Barbadian authorities determined that Cuban exile terrorists Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch are responsible. Both are arrested. And then their story about how they escape and whatnot and all that. But, it is interesting. But I recommend folks do their own investigation, check who those folks are. Those are two known terrorists that we harbored. And we're here, the United States Empire is calling Cuba a state sponsor of terror. Again, we're in no moral position to be saying anything like that, considering how many times we've endorsed terrorism against Cuba, whether it's actual terrorism where people lost their lives or economic terrorism. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And I know in Jersey, it must be rough. Like, I'm from the New York area. They call certain parts of Jersey Havana on the Hudson. And I've personally interacted. One time I was actually at a Cuban bar. I didn't know it was owned by Gusanos, but whatever. I didn't really think about it. And they had a sign that said, Viva Cuba Republicana, 1898 to 1959. Which is basically the apartheid era. Like if they're saying that, they're saying they're white supremacists basically, because that was when Black and Indigenous people were subservient. They were completely at the will of white capitalists from the US, from Cuba. And so it's just pretty disgusting. So Yamir, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience going to Cuba? When did you go? What did you do out there? What did you observe while you were there? And also, how does that connect with why you support the Cuban Revolution?
Yeah, so I went on the same delegation as Oni. We were on the Venceremos Brigade delegation. And I'm also part of that as well, the national organization of the Venceremos Brigade. I went, I think it was like a year and a half. It was 2019. Yeah, I mean, going over there, I went with an open mind, because that's the best advice you're supposed to give somebody who has not been to Cuba. Like, go there with an open mind, because you don't want to go there thinking like all this leftist stuff from what you read in books, and like trying to be very I guess like pragmatic or like puritist. Like, basically you got to go to Cuba with an open mind, because it's basically a society that's blockade, and yeah, it has like it's certain aesthetics that's like capitalistic. Like, people think you go over there and everybody's dressed up like Fidel, everybody's dressed up like Che. Like, not like you go to Havana and people got like their little swag going on still, like with their cigars and like their cars from the 50s. And I mean, that's cool and all, you know what I mean? And they're still like, they're still like revolutionary in a way. Like, I remember going over there and me thinking like, damn, these Cubans are like bougie, and like, cause they're like into Bad Bunny and stuff. And it's actually in Cuba that I got into Bad Bunny. I never liked Bad Bunny, but it was actually going to like parties in Cuba with the college students that I got into Bad Bunny. But still, like, shit is still revolutionary. Like, they're still screaming out Viva Fidel and Viva Che and Viva Camilo and many other revolutionary figures. Like, that's the thing that I liked a lot about Cuba, is that they really uplift like either like their Black or their white revolutionary figures, from Jose Marti to Antonio Maceo to even Mariana Grajales, that she is considered the mother of the homeland. Like, and she's a Jamaican immigrant that went to Cuba and fought for the independence in the 1800s. I was like, whoa. this is dope, because it's like here in the United States, it's so patriarchal that they don't even like, the white people here don't even have like a mother of the homeland. Over there in Cuba, their mother of the homeland is a black woman from Jamaica, Caribbean, and that I found that very powerful. As far as like my whole experience through the brigade, yeah, like I got the experience to work on the camps, on the land with campesinos. I got to go through like different Cuban institutions, and just and go from Havana all the way to Santiago. And man, when you go to Santiago is like the Harlem of Cuba. Like, you feel like it's so like Africanized, and they call it actually la cuna de la revolución, like the cradle of the revolution, because all of Cuba's independence efforts has happened from Santiago, like from the independence from Spain with the Mambises, to Fidel organizing the Cuban Revolution from Santiago. That's where you had actually the attack on the Moncada barracks. So yeah, it's just a lot to get into with Cuba. You go through the whole society celebrating the revolution, and also realizing that their revolution never stopped. Like, it never stopped in 1959. It's an ongoing process. Like, they'll tell you that their society is not perfect. There's a lot of imperfection. Like it's like, when do we here ever say that we're ever imperfect or try to talk about our contradictions? It's like, never. And it's like, they literally had a change of constitution not too long ago, and we still got the same constitution from a bunch of slave masters. Like, wait, I actually got it right here. I got the slave master, like, genocide constitution. I gotta, sometimes you gotta read from the enemy and understand. That's what Sun Tzu teaches us. But I mean, yeah, like, I support the Cuban Revolution just because Cuba has been like a shining red star for Latin America, for the Caribbean, for the third world. Just like my background, I'm Colombian. I was born here, but just understanding what like Cuba has done in solidarity with Colombia, as far as facilitating peace talks between the left-wing guerrillas of the FARC and the government of Colombia, which the United States has never wanted to support, because they love the fact that they have a reason to have military bases, over 9 military bases in Colombia, to make Colombia into the Israel of Latin America. So I support Cuba because Cuba has supported my people's, just like everybody else's struggle worldwide.
That's what's up, man. That's very powerful to hear. And I'm sure for all the countries that we represent here today, Puerto Rico, DR, Honduras, Haiti, like, Cuba has played a role all over the world and has put forward that internationalist perspective that is missing so much nowadays, and understanding that we are a global working class, Black, brown, indigenous people, women have to be at the forefront of revolution. And I think that's such a great point you mentioned about going with a scientific and non-dogmatic perspective, because there's a lot of white leftists, unfortunately, who go into the global South, into revolutionary countries, and they're like, oh, like, they have a small business, they're not real socialists. Oh, that building has a little bit of dust on it, that's not real social, and they have this like metaphysical idealist view of what socialism is, without explaining, like you said, Yami, that it's a process, that it's something that you undergo under very harsh conditions, that you maneuver through and build, and it takes years to do. And so, pivoting a little bit to the current events and the topic, Anya, Sanwo, I wanted to get some feedback and analysis from you about, why do you think this is happening now? Like, this is literally the last few days of Trump's administration. We saw, all the crazy shit that happened in DC, which part of me was like, I don't know what's really going on there, but my instincts is telling me something is weird. And, what the context of what's going on, like, why is this happening now? And how do you think US-Cuba relations will be under Biden?
So it's a combination of factors. But first of all, I want to thank both you and Yamir for pointing out that socialism is a process, that you're not going to snap your fingers and have a perfect socialist state. And also, Cuba's economy is being blockaded. They're being strangled economically. So of course, they're going to have to open up to private investment. Of course, they're going to have to make compromises they don't want to, because they're being attacked by the US government. And they have been so for over 60 years, continuously. If you want to see a perfect socialist project in Cuba and you live in the empire, then overthrow that empire. Stop criticizing them. It annoys the shit out of me. Also, but so reason why it's happening is that it's a combination of factors. First and foremost, Mike Pompeo has aspirations of running for office in 2024. Mike Pompeo is basically using the opportunity to attack Cuba, to also attack Iran for clout, just straight up for clout. He wants to build his brand as someone who's like tough on socialism, tough on terror, and he's doing so by attacking Cuba opportunistically. Like, that's what it is. Beyond that, they want to set it up so that the Biden administration is kind of backed into a corner in terms of opening up relations with Cuba again. They want to make it poison the well so much and make it so hard to reverse that the Biden administration is kind of forced into the path that they set. Obviously, Biden is an imperialist, racist, white supremacist, capitalist, but he had promised or made motions toward restoring relations with Cuba back to the level they were during the Obama administration. So, more free access to travel, less restrictions in terms of remittances, in terms of transferring money to the island. And so that would have been positive for Cuba. Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration are interested in stopping that. But beyond that, whenever the US government attacks Cuba, it's about what Cuba accomplished in terms of destroying imperialism, chasing it out of their country, and also in terms of what Cuba represents, particularly for colonized nations around the world in the global South. Cuba decisively defeated US imperialism. Cuba chased out capitalism from their island. Cuba built an independent socialist project, and they did so less than 100 miles off the coast of the United States. And so for the US empire, which has like a lot of investment in this image of it as invincible, Cuba is very, very clear proof that it's not. Cuba is very, very clear proof that organized, colonized peoples can win their liberation even against a much stronger enemy and maintain that freedom. And beyond that, Cuba is a majority African and indigenous population. Cuba is not a white country. And the United States' whole myth is based on this myth of white supremacy. So this is a non-white country that defeated imperialism, that's right off the coast, that it keeps flexing their freedom in the face of the US empire. So whenever the US attacks Cuba, it's because the US literally cannot take the existence of such a free place.
Yeah, definitely. It comes to mind whenever I was in New York. I went to a shitty public school, and we had some racist white teachers, and the teachers were white, and all the kids in the class were black, brown, West Indian, Latino, and there was always that one joker kid in the back who didn't give a fuck what the teacher said when the teacher was being racist and rude, who's just kept being the class inspiration and the cool kid. And that's what kind of Cuba reminds me of for the global South, for Latin America, is that island, that people that will never bow down to humiliation no matter what, and they will always stand up, and they'll do so with joy. I think that's the most beautiful part about it, is that they're not melancholy, they're not pessimistic, they're we saw the video, and we'll play it later on as well, but even their media reflects the joyous nature of what they are, because they're defined by socialism and what they are, and not by their what they're not. So Nick, what do you think about why is this happening now, and how do you think it's going to change under Biden?
Yeah, well, I just want to go back real quick to what Ymir was saying about or what we were just generally talking about Cuban solidarity and how important that is internationally. The funny story that happened to me when I spent 6 weeks in Vietnam, and in Vietnam, there's a deep connection between Vietnam and Cuba, and the solidarity between the two, especially during the Vietnamese War. And I remember I was staying with a host family, and I told them, they asked where I was from. I told them I was from the U.S. They're like, no, you're not from the U.S. You're not white. And I was like, all right, well, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Dominican. And they're like, Puerto Rican, Dominican? I've never heard of those countries. Where's that at? I was like, all right, you know Cuba? I'm like Cuban. And they're like, oh, okay, we know where you are. So every time we went out anywhere, they would say, oh yeah, he's Cuban. And because they didn't know anything, they didn't know the Caribbean too well. They knew Cuba though. Everyone in Vietnam knew Cuba, and they loved Fidel. Anytime I mentioned Fidel, they were like, oh yeah, we love Fidel. He's like Ho Chi Minh. And it was, it was very clear to me that there was a deep connection between Cuban solidarity and Vietnamese solidarity, and that solidarity really it lasted generations, it lasted decades, and that's how important it was for the people there. And so I think that kind of highlights just the strength of Cuban solidarity and Cuban internationalism, and that really hit home for me when I went there and I saw that firsthand. But as for what's going on right now, I agree mostly that it's what it is it's Mike Pompeo and it's the Trump administration really trying to do all they can to punish nations. I mean, you saw what they did to Iran. They labeled them. They try to connect Iran and Al Qaeda. Complete BS. No, like no connection whatsoever. They're trying to say the Houthis are terrorists. They're trying to say Cuba's a state-sponsored terrorist. They're trying to like lay out all their attacks in the last 2 weeks of the Trump administration because this is their last stand. And this is going to be, you know, right before they leave. They know that Biden's going to try to undo everything. But I think what's really important here to highlight and recognize is that you have two different strategies of imperialism that are playing out against Cuba right now. You have the Trump strategy, you have the neoconservative strategy, which is a very hard-line, hard-fisted strategy of, okay, we're going to label them as terrorists. We're going to get the whole country, they're going to get the whole world to try to blockade these people, to try to isolate them, to alienate them, to do to Cuba what we've done to DPRK, North Korea. That's the neoconservative strategy. The liberal strategy is, I think, what we just saw recently in the San Isidro movement. So the San Isidro movement was a cultural movement of artists, of rappers, musicians, embedded in Havana, who were working with U.S. ambassadors, the CIA, politicians from the U.S., who were trying to essentially push an anti-Castro, anti-socialist message in Havana through culture and through art. That's the liberal strategy. That's I think that was the Obama strategy. That's probably going to be the strategy that Biden might try to push when he comes into power. Because really that strategy is a little bit more covert, a little bit harder to recognize and see at first, but it's a very effective strategy because it's a psychological one. It attacks the minds of the Cuban people rather than attacking their material. And I think that's something else we have to be wary of, because that was, you know, I don't think San Isidro movement is going to be the last type of movement, the last type of cultural movement that tries to influence Cubans in a negative direction. So I think why we're seeing what we're seeing right now is because this is the last straw for Trump. He's really trying to he's going to try to play all his cards and push Biden back into a corner to make him seem like he's soft on terrorism, like he's soft on socialism, and he's actually, you know, some closet socialist who likes Cuba. That's why he's trying to support them, which we all know is totally made up. You know, that's not true at all. But I think that's where we're going with this.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to see a good point about the tactics changing, because we're going to see in a few months the shitty Vice articles like "Meet the Underground Collective" challenging Cuba's communist government, and the attempt to create this color revolution style support for these hipsters, paid gusanos, counter-revolutionaries. Victor, why don't you tell us, break down a little bit the same, you know, what do you think is going to happen now with Biden in office? You know, is it this new strategy, same goal? What do you think is gonna take place?
Yeah, so I mean Nick and I'm sorry, wait, I'm sorry, what sister, how do you pronounce your name?
Anya Sanwo, or you can just say Oni.
Oni? Oni. All right. They really hit it on the head. The Mike Pompeo stuff I think really nails it. I mean, when this rolled out, my initial reaction, I follow Pompeo on Twitter, and this is just a despicable human being. I can't stand, like, when you think about this for a second. This was the former director of the CIA, right? That within the context of again, when the United States is an empire. So if you're the director of the CIA, that the former director said, that should automatically disqualify you for being Secretary of State, like immediately. Like imagine you being a foreign country and this is who you're bringing as your top diplomat. Like this guy was the former head of the CIA. So when I saw this roll out, I said, you know, Trump is not, I don't think has the wherewithal or the presence of mind during these last days to think, you know what, let me further punish Cuba. I don't even, this has Mike Pompeo's hands. This has Mike Pompeo written all over it. But as far as Biden, look, will they roll back some of this stuff? Possibly. But are the NED programs, National Endowment for Democracy programs, going to stop? No. Are CIA programs going to stop? You know, and no. You know, are we're gonna end the blockade? No. So, you know, I hope that there's at least some opening there where, again, we roll back some of the stuff that the U.S. is doing now. But as far as having any real hope that things are going to actually change Look, I love to say that yes, that's for Cuba's sake, right? And I love to say yes, that's a real possibility, but I don't see our taxpayer dollars, the taxpayer dollars that we use now to go to these again, these democracy initiative programs in Latin America, quote unquote. I don't see that stopping. The San Isidro movement, we talked about it on the last Sons of Fidel podcast, and I mentioned their connection to the former Secretary General of the OAS, the Organization of American States, and I mentioned how in 2014, folks can look this up. There's an NPR article, what a failed hip hop experiment can teach us about the future of U.S. Cuba relations. And in that whole article, there's a whole thing there about how we did this. We did this in 2014. Like the playbook is the same playbook. It's the same thing. It's the same thing we did, in 2014 in Cuba. It's the same thing we did with. You could go to WikiLeaks and you can find out how much money we've pumped into the quote unquote student movements in Venezuela. It's the same playbook, right? And so I love to say that under a Biden administration that we can normalize relations with Cuba. I don't have too much hope.
Word, yeah, definitely. That's a good point. And even the demonic, satanic, I mean, I'm an atheist, but the evilness of using hip hop, which is developed by Africans, to impose a government that will enslave African and oppress African people, like that's just fucking disgusting. And it's crazy because the imperialists understand the power of music, the power of hip hop. And I'm sure Yamir will get into that as well, because he is really invested and has done a lot of work in that aspect of culture and revolution as well. Yamir, what do you think about what's next for Cuba? Under Biden, will we see any real change? And what do you think is up next for U.S.-Cuba relations?
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback what Victor and Nick has been saying, and Oni, I mean, the Biden administration's tactic is going to be more soft power approach, but it's very interesting how they're going to use now culture. And the San Isidro movement is not like, I don't believe it's like the first time they try to do that. Like, I remember there was this group I used to listen to a couple of years ago called Los Aldeanos, that there's like a Cuban duo and that they're like against the government, and like they'll do stuff like they'll wear a Che Guevara shirt, but they'll say fuck Fidel, you know what I mean? They'll say fuck the government, but they'll say Viva la Revolución. Like I remember I used to listen to them because I used to be like, oh damn, these motherfuckers are like, they're mad lyrical in Spanish, like I listen to a lot of hip hop underground in Spanish. So it's crazy how like they're gusanos, but they're like talented gusanos too. I have to give them that. I mean, I'm sorry, like I'm a hip hop head, so I gotta give them when they got bars, but fuck them because they're gusanos. But and that crazy too.
Jameer, that 2014 article I was referencing, those are the jokers receiving U.S. aid money, USAID money. Yeah. So those are the jokers.
Yeah. No. And actually, I remember too. I used to get into it with like I gotta say, like with the Afro-Latino community in New York that used to support them. They used to be like, oh, they're not getting money from the CIA. All of that is lie. And I mean, they would say they left us, But I mean, yeah, you just said that they were getting money. But also, when I was on the island, I remember I spoke to people about Los Aldeanos, and a lot of them would say like, yo, them guys said that they were never leaving Cuba and they left Cuba, And it goes to show, like, it's crazy what they would, like, where they are 10 years from now, and they're, like, in Miami. They're with, like, the Miami Gusanos on television show and all this other stuff. So everything is always brought to light. But they also have, one of them has actually a song called Gusano, too. I mean, if y'all want to check it out. But, I mean, yeah, like, it's very telling how now the U.S. is going to try to use art, and it's art created by African and indigenous people, African and Latino people in the South Bronx. Like when we talk about the history, the origins of hip hop coming from the South Bronx, created by African people and Puerto Ricans from the diaspora, and also Cubans from the diaspora too, because people don't know New York City has a history of having Cubans that was in support of the revolution. That we have organizations like La Casa de las Americas, and also Jose Martí spent some time here in New York City I think this is actually the place where the Cuban flag was forged, I believe. Well, the modern day Cuban flag. But I think, yeah, this is going to be the Biden's administration new tactic. Like right now with Venezuela, where I've heard that Biden is willing to sit down with Maduro and talk about how he's willing to lift sanctions if they call for a free and fair election, whatever that means. Like what we see in the electoral process right now, where Trump is saying that they robbed them of the elections, and that you know, it goes to show like what do they mean when they want free and fair elections?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Yamir, you hit on a crucial point when you said that group, those jokers that Victor called them, which they are definitely jokers, they use a tactic that the CIA has used a lot abroad, where they support ultra-left people who use ultra-left language to oppose the left. It's called attacking the left from the left. And it's something that we saw, especially after World War II and the Congress for Cultural Freedom, when the US government is like, look, this method of attacking, scaring the crap out of people with communism and being like, the whole world's going to go on fire and they're going to eat your babies, that is clearly not working. What we need to do is start supporting groups who are quote unquote leftists or who are real communists and attack the Marxist-Leninists or revolutionaries from that perspective. And that's something that we've seen played out in the global South a lot, you know, when you're talking about US support for Cambodia, US support for certain groups that were calling themselves Maoist groups in the global South that were attacking Marxist-Leninists. It also happened in Angola against the MPLA when the MPLA was fighting for their liberation. Cuba, Vietnam were supporting MPLA, but the US government was also supporting these quote unquote Maoist groups or ultra-left groups that were fighting the MPLA. And so I think it's a clear strategy that I think you and Victor really hit on that's really important. So we're at 57 minutes. I want everybody to see this brilliant and amazing and inspiring video that Cuba produced a few weeks ago. It's called Con Cuba no te metas, with don't fuck with Cuba, basically. Don't fuck with us. And yes, don't fuck with Cuba. We got Cuba's back. So we're going to play this video. We're going to watch it, enjoy it, dance if you want to dance. We're all salseros. We like music. And then we're just going to get some final thoughts from our comrades on the panel.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren, pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
Han formado un titingo, se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
con la conga de los hoyos no te metas.
Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
¿Y dónde
nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
You hear that, Mike Pompeo? Don't fuck with Cuba. That's a beautiful ass video. I love that video. It's called Con Cuba No Te Metas, released by the Ministry of Culture. So before we wrap up, we're just gonna get some final thoughts from all of our comrades. I do want to start with Comrade Danny, co-host Sons of Fidel, holding it down. Maybe Danny, why don't you give us a little bit of analysis on what this all means, the quote unquote state sponsor of terrorism, how we can support, show our solidarity with Cuba, and any advice for people moving forward.
Yeah, peace. Thanks to Anticonquista for organizing this. And for me, coming on, I'm just coming out of work, but to come out to that song was like coming out for a heavyweight fight. You know, that was the song that I would choose. Cuba represents self-determination and dignity. And Miguel Diaz-Canel said yesterday, the U.S. does everything to kill us, but here we are. We insist on living and overcoming. I think with the Biden administration coming in, we have to be very alert in the left. What do these soft coups look like? I'm sure you all covered Pompeo and Trump 11th hour sanctions as there's these white supremacist mobs vying for power, but their priority is to strangle Yemen and try to continue starving Cuba and Venezuela. With Biden coming in, the left should not get lackadaisical. The soft coup, that's their preferred model to try to infiltrate Cuba with U.S. aid and National Endowment for Democracy and all these funding streams, float around all these U.S. dollars, which in Cuba are worth roughly 20 of the Cuban currency, even though now the government is joining those two currencies. When they float around all these dollars, particularly Cuban youth, it can be very deceptive or attractive when you're in a blockaded country and you haven't had the privileges that maybe we have in an exploiter nation, to have a passport and a visa to travel the world. So Cuban youth in particular have to be in the vanguard, watching out for these soft coups. They've used similar strategies. They announced this week in England 750,000 English pounds that are suddenly freed up to promote. It's always promoting democracy. Whenever you hear that, you know it's a red flag. And it's just amazing that at the height of the coronavirus, when 4,300 on average of our people, mostly oppressed people from working class backgrounds, are dying every day, in the US, their priority continues to be overthrowing the independent sovereign governments and peoples of Nicaragua, of Cuba, of Zimbabwe, of Venezuela, of Yemen, China, Russia, Vietnam, DPRK, any country they can't control. And I think the Zimbabwean president said it best last week as this failed, miserable, pathetic coup attempt went down. The president of Zimbabwe said, you know, never again can you pretend to give us sermons about democracy when your own house is not in order, and we can see right through you. It's clearer than ever what imperialism's priorities are across the world. So I'm glad we can have this dialogue with our community on the importance of standing with Cuba. We need to bring internationalism and anti-imperialism to all of our demonstrations against the racist police, against budget cuts, the fight for a better stimulus package for working families. How can we infuse internationalism and anti-imperialism? So all power to the people, leales siempre, traidores nunca, venceremos, always faithful to the struggle, never sell out, we shall overcome.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Leales siempre, traidores nunca. And I'm so glad, Danny, you were able to come through and share those inspiring words. Anya Sanwo, Comrade Anya Sanwo in Albuquerque, any final thoughts on everything going on with Cuba, and also how people can get involved and support the Cuba Solidarity movement? Because I know these are going to be some rough times coming up.
I'm definitely seconding everything that Danny said, and also someone's knocking my door and my dog's about to flip out. Yeah, it's really, really important that we have to build an internationalist, an anti-imperialist analysis into social justice movements in the United States. Sorry, can someone else answer and then I'll come back?
I feel you. It's all good, yo. Hopefully you're good. We're more concerned about you. But Nick, why don't you go ahead and tell us, your final thoughts on everything that's going on? What can people do to support? Because this is a time now for people to support Cuba.
Well, I always think education, political education, fighting the propaganda machine that is in the U.S. empire is always important. It's always a good start. Getting out there, intertwining, like Danny said, intertwining that internationalism with what's going on domestically and what we're doing here is also important. Is also a necessary step, I think, on the road to actually showing solidarity and actually trying to combat what our imperialist nation is doing. And I also think recognizing the strategies of the imperialists. With the San Isidro movement, one thing that's important to note is what they are trying to do nowadays is they're trying to tie liberal identity politics to these soft coups, to these attacks on nations, socialist nations. They don't get right wing white gusanos to be in Cuba and say, "Oh, F Fidel," because they know no one will buy that. No one's going to eat that propaganda. So they're going to try to call off black folks, indigenous folks who like it was explained before, who are suffering from a blockade and are suffering from so much economic turmoil that it's you throw some cash in front of some people's faces and it's easy for them to be bought off, or it's easy for them to be won over. One of the most amazing things about Cuba, though, is you try to do that to Cubans, and the majority will say, "Get the hell out of here! Get that shit out of my face. I'm not gonna fight for the U.S. empire because I know the U.S. empire has always been a demon to me and my people." But there are always going to be a few and a couple who are going to sell out. And so what the soft coups and what these new neoliberal powers are going to try to do is they're going to try to get people who look like us to tell us that Cuba is bad or Castro is bad. And that's one of the things we got to watch out for. Because, they did the same with Nicaragua. They got those students to go out and act like they're all against the Nicaraguan government and that they're students protesting. At the end of the day, they were really right-wing fascists who are out there against Ortega. And that's really what the new soft coup. That's what it's like a liberal identity politics, imperialism that's coming out now. That's going to be the new face of these attacks against our nation.
Yeah, most definitely that intersectional imperialism. They'll probably get AOC or somebody like that out there to start promoting that garbage. But Anya Sanwo, why don't you go ahead and finish what you were saying?
Yeah, I'm really glad I came in after Nick was speaking because I absolutely agree. And the point I was gonna make is that there's all these movements against police terrorism, for housing justice, for healthcare, social justice movements in the United States that have very just causes that desperately need an international analysis, that need to understand, as the comrade pointed out at the top of the show, that all the things that we are fighting for in terms of like basic rights, basic needs for U.S. citizens, Cuba has already accomplished, and Cuba accomplished that through collective struggle, through the masses of Cuban people building the world they wanted to see. And that's a very powerful example for African people in the United States, for colonized people in the United States, because it shows that we can do it against the same enemy. But we have to reject any attempt to use us to attack Cuba. We have to learn the truth about Cuba for ourselves. We have to understand that the very same government, that lies about African people on TV, that sends police into our neighborhoods to brutalize us and attack us, is not going to tell the truth about a non-white country. It's going to attack that country in very, very similar ways to the ways that it attacks us. And so we need to start making these international connections between social justice movements in the United States to anti-imperialist struggles around the world. And that way, we can start to build a movement that can actually contest for power, that can actually threaten this empire. It's the only way it's going to happen. And so the first step in doing that is for folks who have been to Cuba to tell the truth. There's a part in that really dope song that's stuck in my head now, Con Cuba no te metas, where they're like, if you want confusion, you'll stay confused. If you want to see the truth, come here and see it for yourself. And that's exactly my experience. As soon as I saw Cuba for myself, I understood I had been lied to about it for my whole life. And so for those of us who have had the opportunity to go see it, we have to tell people the truth. We can't just keep that in our heads. We have to share it with our community, particularly with African, Indigenous, Chicano, colonized people. Tell them the truth. And then for the folks who cannot, afford an international trip, which is real, like most colonized people in the United States, we have to seek out sources of information about Cuba that are not the same media that are lying about us. So not CNN, not MSNBC, not Fox. Seek out Cuban news sources like Granma, seek out anti-imperialist news sources like Telesur to find the actual truth about Cuba. Seek out Cuban voices for themselves, not the white ones living in Florida, but the African and indigenous ones that are still in Cuba who are speaking for themselves. We have to counter this narrative, these lies about Cuba. We have to internationalize social justice movements, and we have to build anti-imperialist struggles across borders.
Well said. Holy crap. That was so right on, Comrade Anya, Sanwo. Victor, what do you want to wrap up with? Any thoughts on what's next, how people can support and stand in solidarity with Cuba?
Yeah, so join an anti-imperialist organization. Just start with that. And I just about Cuba. Think about some of the things that they've gotten accomplished. The lowest, the highest literacy rate in the hemisphere, lower infant mortality rate now than the United States, average lifespan comparable to the United States. It's the safest country in the region. Like it's just, I haven't heard one person who's gone to Cuba and was like, oh my God, look, I'm Dominican American. I could take you to the Dominican Republic and I'm gonna take you to a certain place in the Dominican Republic and I'm gonna be like, listen, just be on your P's and Q's because it's not safe around here. All right. I could take you to Camden. I could take you to, I'm in Jersey, right? Jersey. I could take you to Camden, Trenton, Newark, the Oranges, Irvington. And I'm gonna take you to the hood. And I'm in certain parts that, 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, you're not from there. You really shouldn't be there. All right. So it's the safest country in the region, the most doctors per capita in the world, the most medical technical professionals per capita in the world, the most educators per capita in the world. They have a surplus of doctors, right? So they send doctors all over the world to remote regions where other doctors just won't go, right? Tremendous advances in biotechnology and nanotechnology, produces some of the best athletes in the world, Olympic gold medalists, some of the best ballet dancers in the world, free education, free healthcare. And they've exported revolutionary foreign policy, countering U.S. hegemony in places like Africa, in places like Latin America, right? I mean, we can go on, right, and talk about, and again, knowing that Cuba is not a paradise, right? Neither is the United States. Turn on your TV. We're in no moral position to be calling out other nations and they're talking about their internal conflicts and their internal contradictions, talking about, oh, you need to clean this. Who are we to say that? Just turn on your TV. Look what happened, on January 6th. Yes, join an anti-imperialist organization. Join a move, be a part of that movement that will defend Cuba. That will, if again, for folks who just don't know, I suggest, maybe even link up with us, hit us up. None of us are afraid to talk and build. We've said that on our podcast, yeah, I mean, I would strongly encourage folks to do that. This is the right moment. I mean, it's always the right moment, but especially now, join an anti-imperialist organization, get involved with the movement and defend Cuba and defend Latin Americans, the right of peoples all over the world to be politically self-determined, to be sovereign, right? And that goes with international law. We should not be meddling with the internal conflicts of other countries. So, con Cuba no te metes, get the fuck out of Cuba. Don't mess with Cuba. Don't meddle with Cuba. And let's allow this free exchange of ideas. Let's allow folks to travel to Cuba and see for themselves, to see what's going on in Cuba. And the Cubans, I'm sure could learn a little bit about us working class people. We could learn a lot from them. So that would be my message.
Cool, compañero Yamir.
I think my message is Yeah, understanding the legacy of the Cuban Revolution. And I mean, there's different definitions. I mean, there's different interpretations on the legacy of the Cuban Revolution. But one thing I always keep in mind is that Cuba will never be nobody's casino ever again. I guess that's like one of the biggest message of the revolution, of saying that like our resources will not be gambled on the international markets. Our resources will be distributed to our people for their self-determination, for their health, for their education, and for their upliftment as an island full of colonized people. Cuba has shown the world that there's a different way to organize themselves, to organize one's own society. And I think that us in the belly of the beast, we have to keep coming with the counter propaganda, so people, colonized people, indigenous, African, Latino people within the belly of the beast can understand why we have to be connected with Cuba, why us defending Cuba is us defending ourselves, because Cuba has been there for Latin America, has been there for Africa, for Asia, and for the Middle East, and we have to be in always constant solidarity. So it's like Fidel said about Cuba, que aquí nadie no se rinde, carajo. Nobody will bow down to U.S. imperialism, and hasta la victoria siempre. Con Cuba no se mete.
Don't fuck with Cuba. Well said, Yamir. Danny, let's wrap up with you. What are your final thoughts on Cuba? What can people do to stand in solidarity and support with our sisters and brothers in Cuba?
Yeah. Just like the comrades, los compañeros han dicho ya, join a revolutionary organization. Keep hitting the books, learn the true history of Cuba, the Caribbean, all the oppressed countries. Right now, there's a ton of momentum across Latin America. The people are in the streets in La Ciudad de Guatemala, in Peru, in Chile, in Haiti. Haiti's always in the vanguard, the most oppressed, the most exploited, the most blockaded. That was the Cuba of 1804, and never forgiven Haiti for what Haiti stands for. We have elections coming up in 3 weeks in Ecuador. The anti-imperialist forces, El Correísmo, has a ton of momentum. So I think South America, one of the richest regions of the entire world, and the Caribbean, they're in la vanguardia. They're at the vanguard right now of these incredible struggles for self-determination across the world. We have a ton to learn from Cuba. That's why there's been this cruel travel blockade, a blockade I first broke when I was 16 years old, 1995, when I first went to Cuba. I'm a student of the Cuban Revolution, of the Cuban people. All of humanity owes a tremendous debt to the people of Cuba, who've had to withstand this wicked, diabolical Babylon blockade now for 6 decades. Con Cuba no te metas, leave Cuba alone. Cuba's just trying to breathe freely with self-determination, and that's what the Pompeos and the Bidens and the Elliott Abrams and all these other devils, the Trumps, the Obamas, cannot forgive. That Cuba, a small country of 11 million people, could be that shining star, and that's a shining star that has shone over Africa, over all oppressed countries, while the U.S. has been busy sending troops in a genocidal way to Vietnam, to Syria, to Libya, recolonizing the entire world. Cuba in the 1970s sent 500,000 of their soldiers to fight for self-determination in Angola, in Ethiopia, in Cape Verde, in Guinea-Bissau. So the social system of Cuba represents the diametrical opposite of everything here in the capitalist U.S. As Ernesto Che Guevara said, capitalism wants to convert all of society into a gigantic school of capitalism, whereas we as socialists, as revolutionaries, as anti-imperialists, we want to convert all of society into a gigantic school of socialism. And that's what the Cubans have done. As Victor said, it has not been easy. If you go to Cuba, of course people are struggling. If you've been blockaded, this unipolar U.S. blockade, this criminal blockade that the United Nations every year, 195 countries are against this blockade, but there's the U.S. and Zionism continually buttressing this blockade. This is what we oppose. We oppose this unipolar model, and we can see that the empire está en declive. The empire is on decline, and the Cuban self-sacrifice will ultimately, be the example for humanity. So maximum respect to the Cuban comrades, to the Cuban people who hold it down on a daily basis.
Well said, Danny. What a great way to wrap up. And I want to thank all the comrades here. Thank you so much I just had such a great conversation with like-minded comrades, with the Anticonquista Familia, with AAPRP, with Venceremos, with Sons of Fidel, with Red Condor, everybody that's involved in our community. Shout out to Erica Keynes in the chat. I love Erica. We got to do another podcast with Comrade Erica soon. Shout out to Falcon General, to Obnoxious Anarchists, to everybody who's watching and listening. Before we go, I just want to also announce that in the description of this video, if you're listening to this as a podcast, go to our YouTube and our website. We are accepting applications for Fund the Resistance. We don't collect any money for ourselves, Anticonquista. All the money that we raise, we send back to groups in Latin America and the Caribbean in direct mutual aid. And so we recently just sent $1,500 to our Garifuna comrades in Honduras. We're going to have a video about that soon. We've also sent money to comrades in Chile, Colombia, Puerto Rico, and Haiti. And we're also accepting applications for new groups to help support in Latin America and the Caribbean. Again, that's part of the practical work that we can do here in the diaspora, support women-led, Black and Indigenous-led revolutionary movements back home in La Matria Grande. So go to our description, look for that link, pull up that information. If you have a group that you want to support, that you want us to help support, put their information out there and we can make that happen. That's part of the work that we do. But thanks again to comrades Nick, Anya, Sanwo, Danny, Yamir, Victor. I love y'all. We got to do this again. I love having y'all on. Let's do this again because we got to keep building this community, keep building our people. Con Cuba no te metas, we're going to go out with this beautiful song because everybody needs to hear this song. Don't fuck with Cuba. Yes, that's you, Mike Pompeo, Biden, everybody. Don't fuck with Cuba.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los doyos no te metas.
No te metas, no te metas. Cuba viva sin que nadie la someta. No te metas, no te metas. Mi tierra linda, mi cubanía, mi bandera se respeta. Defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
No te metas, no te metas. Que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Se respeta, se respeta. Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano.
Se respeta, se respeta.
No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
No te metas, no te metas.
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda.
No te metas.
Aguanta, Ibero, dime tú, pa' que tú inventas.
tienes miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. ¡Hey! Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.
Porque tú me conoces bien en todas mis facetas. Que no tenemos miedo, sal de ahí, no abra esa gaveta.
No te metas.